Alda, Palisoli. It was just before dawn in the Legis Mercantile City Republic of Palisoli, a rare moment of calm and quiet before the riotous day. The stone streets of the central markets were sluiced clean, the copper bell that hung where their four corners met scoured and gleaming. The clattering of wheels faded away as the last of the night soil merchants dragged his full cart into the Cunacolan, the complex of tunnels that ran underneath the city to keep the shit sellers out of sight. In the markets and bazaars that spider-webbed out from the city center, the merchants had already hung their signs and laid out their wares, and now spent the last tranquil minutes in their day eating thin wheat cakes, or having already broken their fast, smoking a slim stick of Apiton brought in by caravan from the west. In 12 nights, a mixed neighborhood of homes and craftsmen's shops, usually one on top of the other, a slim, dark girl of no more than 15 summers sprinted down an alley between a Wainwright's showroom and a chandlery. She wore a peasant straw hat with the strap tight under her chin, and a long, shapeless dress to match, though it was cut higher than expected, mid-calf rather than the usual ankle, and it didn't hinder her flight. As she ran, she silently cursed the quiet streets, the full moon that still shone, and most of all, herself. Alda, she thought, by the limp-dicked god of drink and disappointment, your timing is perfect, as always. A half-dozen men burst out of a door and into the alley a dozen yards behind her. They wore red leathers emblazoned with a single white chevron on the chest. City keepers. A half an hour later, a few minutes even, and there'd be plenty of people on these streets, a crowd to disappear into. One of the men sighted Alda and whistled, loud and sharp. A point, a shout, and they were after her. They weren't slow. The alley dumped Alda out into a wider thoroughfare, and she tried frantically to get her bearings without slowing down. Left, she thought. She went left, aiming, she hoped, for more populated areas. She sped past more shops, a silversmith, a framer, a clothier who worked only in silks, a money lender's shop, of course. Every neighborhood had at least one, though they weren't always as reputable as this one appeared. But everything was still shuttered and closed, the market for higher-end goods not being profitable till later in the day, when the wealthy generally arose. Alda added the rich to her list of things she cursed as she ran. "Thief!" came a shout from the men behind her. "Halt!" New recruit, she thought. None of the other keepers shouted. Why would they? I already know what I am. And she certainly wasn't stopping. Thief. Such a short and simple word for such a complex and old profession. There were other old professions a girl born in the streets of a merchant city like Palisoli could have entered into. Alda far preferred pilfery and grift. Of course, if my mother had been a thief instead of a whore, I might never have been born. Or if I had been, I might have known my father's name. These were not thoughts to give wings to her feet, so she clamped down on them and concentrated on speed, and figuring out where I'm heading. The shops flew by and told her nothing about her location. 12 Nights wasn't the kind of neighborhood she was familiar with. It was the kind of neighborhood that hired guards to keep people like her out. But Herod had given her maps to go with the job and bribed the guards to look the other way, and if she'd been walking out calmly, she wouldn't be turned around right now. But no, a random keeper's patrol spies you coming out of a house you obviously shouldn't be in, and the whole job goes souls up. Again, these thoughts weren't useful, but she couldn't clamp down on them this time. Neither could she avoid the fear that not only was she running in the wrong direction, but that she was running straight toward Keeper's Castle, which wasn't its real name, because of course that was something annoyingly long and official sounding, and it wasn't actually a castle, just an old stone watchtower that had been converted into a barracks, which wasn't too far from 12 Nights, which explained how the patrol happened to be just passing. My thoughts are running faster than I am. That thought seemed the only reasonable one in the whole bunch, yet it still does nothing to keep me from capture. But then she saw a street signposted in Old Cola, and knew that not only was she leaving 12 Nights, she was, joy of joys, heading in the right direction. The west edge of 12 Nights was formed by a thin line of old homes with roofs oddly spired in the western style, relics of the 60-year period long ago when the Cola had ruled the city. Once past those, Alda knew she'd be into Archer Market, an open-air market that the poorer Western traders, the one who couldn't afford the licensure and graft necessary to trade in the official Cola and Charn Central Market, had claimed for their own. And on the other side of the market was Archer Gate. She tore past the Cola houses, the moon throwing shadows off the roofs that looked like the hats the Idanian solstice dancers wore, pointed high in the middle with lower points on the corners and deep sweeping curves between all of them. Up ahead, the road narrowed to go through a lone stone arch attached to the remnants of wall that had marked the outer edge of the city 3 centuries ago. Through that, and she'd be out of 12 nights and into Archer Market, which she was sure was quiet and smelled of cook fires and Appleton now, but would soon bustle with commercial activity and smell of Western spices, exotic livestock, and the sweat of 1,000 people come to trade. Not soon enough, I fear. The sound of city keepers' boots on tight-packed dirt was closer now, and she even imagined she could hear their labored breathing. Not as labored as mine, though. If I'd swallow a torch, I don't think my chest could burn as badly. She didn't slow down, however. Don't give up before you're caught, Heron had told her often enough as a child. And don't give up then, either. She forced herself to run faster, churning her legs, cursing under what remained of her breath, and thanking the multitudinous gods of Palisoli that the city keepers were forbidden weapons that might accidentally kill the people they were paid to protect. Bows, mostly. She charged beneath the arch, having added a few feet to her lead. The sky was suddenly unfettered by walls and spread out huge and distressingly dark above her. There were no permanent structures in Archer Market, just the carts and lightly built stalls of the traders who did business there, none higher than the height a tall man could reach. A long, straight thoroughfare stretched out before her, ending at the Archer Gate, two giant iron-bound doors that each required a team of oxen to pull open, with a stone frieze stretching over top that featured a sun setting over tall grasses and the words, "God protect us from the Kola archers," carved in a decorative script. That was where she wanted to go, but she knew she would never reach it if she went right at it. She'd spent the last of her reserves just getting here, and now it felt like her left calf was cramping. Would that I could fly like the Charnish Homemen are said to, she thought, even while castigating herself for such a whimsical thought when she needed to concentrate on staying alive. To either side of the wide thoroughfare, carts and stalls pressed against the main path and each other, forming their own small streets and alleyways, with a logic known only to the traders who worked them. Aldous spotted a gap between a cart loaded with palm fruit and a stall with shelves and shelves of tiny ivory miniatures, and shot through it without slowing. It was a dangerous game she played now, running madly down the crooked pathways that Western traders had made. Westerners, whether Kola, Charn, or those who traced their lineage to any of the other 100 or so smaller countries, tribes, and city-states that the Kola had conquered, were notorious for minding only the business of other Westerners. It was unlikely they would stir themselves to help the city keepers. As far as they were concerned, the lesser people of the world could do as they wished, with and unto each other. But if she ran into something, knocked over a cart, or rattled something breakable off its shelf, that indifference would turn to murderous rage in a heartbeat, and they would gut her before the city keepers got anywhere near her. She felt a bit like the hare that had leapt from the pot into the fire. The Westerners would kill her. The city keepers just wanted to take her to jail. Though the magistrate will almost certainly take one of my hands. Alda thought it best to avoid either situation. Her legs had other ideas. The path between the carts jogged hard right, and as she skidded around the corner, her left leg betrayed her, and she went down, coming up hard against a stall. The stall's owner shot up a stool and came around quick to where she lay. He was of the blood, so carried a horseman's blade, 3 feet of wickedly curved steel already in hand. Terror helped her spring to her feet, and she spent a full second she didn't have trying to guess which way he would swing so she could leap the other way. But she'd come up wedged between his cart and another, and there was no room, so she just stood there stupidly, waiting to die. But the impact mustn't have broken anything, because the trader just spat a particularly vile obscenity at her and sat back down, waving her away from his goods. I'll take insults over steel any day. She turned to run, but knew she had lost too much time. The sun will never rise, the crowds will never come, and I'm going to lose a damn hand. But then she saw that the city keepers weren't as close as she thought. They could only go 2 abreast in the warren of traders and had lost ground clustering to enter. They'd made it back up when she fell, but at least they weren't on her right now. She was exhausted, cramped, and bruised now too, but she wouldn't give up before she was caught. And I wouldn't give up then either. She careened through the market, bouncing off another stall and nudging a couple of carts, but must have caused no damage because nobody stuck anything sharp into her. She even extended the gap between herself and her pursuers, and as they were full-grown men and would certainly smash something if they ran into a cart at full speed, they had to move slower. A bunch of Westerners cutting up a squad of city keepers would make for an interesting international incident. But international incidents concerned her far less than her own safety, and when she finally returned to the main thoroughfare, she was 20 yards from the Archer Gate and completely and utterly spent. She bent over, hands on her knees, gasping and retching, trying desperately to get her traitor's body to move. Don't give up. She stumbled towards the gate, legs and chest on fire, bile in her mouth, knowing it was useless, but moving nonetheless. You're not dead if you're moving. She wasn't sure who had told her that. Sounded like something Heron would say. Doesn't matter. I don't think I'll be moving for long. But then she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the pealing of the great central bell, struck at the start of each day as the first rays of sun cleared the horizon. Palasoli wasn't a city that came slowly to life in the morning. The hours between midnight and dawn were sacrosanct. No public trading of goods was allowed with the exception of food, liquor, and entertainment, all to be consumed or enjoyed on the premises. There was also no congregating at the markets during those hours. Taverns near the popular markets did a brisk business in pre-dawn meals, as people would happily pay for an overpriced breakfast to be so near the market at opening. And when the sun came up, people poured out into the streets and filled the markets and bazaars within minutes. More importantly, for all those purposes, caravans and merchant wagons would have been getting processed outside the walls all through the night, paying their fees, tariffs, and bribes early so they could get right to the business when the day began. When the gates to the city opened, the mad press of people, animals, and vehicles trying to all enter at once was complete chaos. Just the kind of chaos I can use. The oxen minders in charge of opening the archer gate shouted at their teams and cracked their whips, and the sound spurred Alda to one last effort. She shuffled into a jog and then a sprint and was almost to the opening doors when a hand grabbed her by the shoulder and yanked her back. "Got you," the keeper shouted triumphantly, if a bit breathlessly. He definitely did, so she didn't fight it. She went with the pull instead, which the keeper wasn't expecting, and came in close, smelling the sweat and moldy leather of him. It was a dangerous spot to be in, as he was bigger and stronger, and if he got his other hand on her, the game was likely over. But she had gained her balance and her leverage back, and she had a single moment when he was disoriented by her coming to him instead of trying to struggle away like most sane people did. She used that moment to stomp hard on his foot while pulling a thin knife from a sheath strapped to the inside of her left arm. She left the blade jammed through the hand he'd been holding her with and jumped backwards into what was suddenly a crowd of people shouting, animals braying, and vehicles creaking and groaning into motion. His screams of pain barely registered above the din. She dove into the crowd like a cormorant diving for trout, putting a dozen people and half as many vehicles between her and the keepers within seconds. She moved laterally then, ducking under a slow-moving ox cart stacked high with sacks of spices, hitting the ground and rolling to avoid the wheels. Coming out the other side, she didn't bother standing, just scrambled on knees and knuckles under another vehicle, this one pulled by a single camel, and carrying cages of brightly colored fowl stacked on top of each other. The birds squawked in alarm, but made as much impression on the general cacophony as the injured keeper's screams had. On her feet now and still moving, Alda stripped off her hat and tossed it aside, revealing close-cropped black curly hair. She tore the seams on either side of her dress easily, turning it instantly into a rag that fluttered to the ground to be trampled unrecognizably into the dirt. Suddenly she was an apprentice banker, dressed in the tight-fitting tunic and black and white checkered hose of his profession. And if said apprentice looked a little haggard and drawn, well, it was quite early, and he wasn't likely out late on a dalliance, for he was a fine-featured youth, and the young girls probably threw themselves at him by the handful. She plastered a haughty look on her face and placed a hand on the nearest wagon, clearly sent by her master to accompany his investment to market. When the city keeper's charge passed moments later, they didn't give her a second glance. Thank you.
Let's keep it going for Adam Stemple. So, son of a bitch protagonist? Is that your brand?
It kind of is. It's a little, not in the, well, the next POV character is the son of a bitch protagonist.
Awesome. So
this one's just a little naughty.
So what is it that draws you to the amoral, Adam?
Someone just said to me, just last night, a friend of me was, I talked about a friend of ours, so I was like, well, he was son of a bitch, but, I liked him. He's like, yes, he's a broken, violent man, and that's who you gather. That's who you gather to you. So I don't know. I may be a broken, violent man myself.
Well, that sounds like a question for someone far more qualified than me. And where can people find more of your work?
Amazon. This book comes out on August 31st and is available for pre-order now. I have a 3-volume series of how to write fantasy novels that is also available there, and a trilogy, which features a many bastard son of a bitch characters.
Awesome. Well, I say let's keep rattling right along to our next author for the evening. So, Danith McPherson enjoys snowshoeing, kayaking, and stargazing. In keeping with her Scottish heritage, she is a kilt maker and proudly wears McPherson tartan at Convergence and other SFF conventions. Her novels include the YA fantasy Blade of Mad Vision, adult fantasy Monarch of Lightning, and mystery Averted Vision. Her short stories have appeared in the year's Best Fantasy and Horror, Asimov's Science Fiction magazine, Amazing Stories, and other places. Some of them are collected in Roar at the Universe. A second collection, Through the Wall, will be out soon. She is a member of SFWA. Please welcome Danith McPherson.
Thank you. Is this, can you hear this? Is this functioning? Yep. Okay. I'm going to read from Blade of Mad Vision, which is, it's a young adult only because it has young characters in it, but I see no reason why adults couldn't read it too if they so choose. Okay, chapter 1. The girl knelt on the rocky floor of Terrafalla Moon Valley, a gash in the planet Saffrian. Obsessed with her task, she barely felt the jagged surface bruise her skin. Out of thin white bark stripped from a tree that grew miles away, she sliced a crescent using a sharp flint shard. She made another, a mirror image of the first, then she carved a large wedge. Fissures hissed out of hot gases. Captured in hollows, liquid minerals glistened like slick pearls. Ashen light muted their jeweled hues to luminous grays. The girl knew the truth of their brilliant colors and worked from memory. She dipped a twig into amber and stroked it across the crescents. Her other sharpened sticks pierced jade, cinnabar, and indigo pools. She didn't know why she worked by the weak light. Somehow it was necessary for the art. The moon, browned as a sea-washed pebble, so slight she could hold her arm at full length and cover it with her thumb, was part of the creation, part of the whole, as important to discovery as the mineral paint and the husk. The barren stone basin reeked with whispered secrets. Sharp, acrid air smelled like lightning and held little that was breathable. Most living things avoided the poisonous stench. Some who had ventured in and stayed too long were now bones, curled beside putrid ponds. She would not look at them, especially the ones of a human shape. She felt the power that twisted upward through granite and shale, escaping from the planet's soul. Artists came to this place to inhale that energy and exhale its life into their work. The surrounding rocks glistened with their paintings. Some were the girl's own, made with silk point brushes instead of the broken sticks collected on the journey here that she used now. The crudeness of the materials intensified the making. They were right. They were perfect. This was strong art, forceful art that frightened her to her bones, but she could not stop. She would not stop. Never again. Never. With indigo, she sketched the figure of a boy near her own age onto the dappled wedge. He stared with intense eyes, strained and determined. She had never met him, but her pack bulged with sheaves scarred by his image. Even when she set her mind to draw something else, the lines converged into his features. Often the landscape behind him was angular and stark, as alien to her as the clothing that hugged her body. Sometimes he was in local dress, backed by scenery she knew or knew of. Always there was the sword of a style unknown on this planet. She stroked it into his hand. The metallic blue-gray showed leaden in the murky light. She waved a hand over the bark, encouraging the liquid mineral to dry. She creased the stiff skin back and forth, folding the wedge into a fan. My hands should be shaking, she thought, but they were steady and precise. The boy was not the only strange presence to invade her work. On one of the crescents, she sketched the dark-haired girl, pale and faded amber. In ebon and cinnabar, she stroked her own face onto the second, feeling that her art was true and her mind was sound. Using strands of her own long black hair, she lashed casings and twigs together. She curved the twin crescents away from each other like the moon in partial phase, reflected off polished rock. She lashed the fan between them, creasing framed fingers of booted light. Change had happened, was about to happen, was happening now. She raised the sculpture toward the lunar glow. In the gaseous heat she froze. She stood as a radiant statue in a deadly valley, rich air rising around her. She was more than creator. She was entwined within the twigs and bark. She was inside the change. It was wrong to remain still when the world was shifting. She thrust her arms forward and released the painted structure, setting it free. In the pale, hollow, steaming gases propelled it upward. It soared across the whispering plumes, circling in quick swoops and slow glides. She pivoted to keep it in her sight. The winged silhouette rose as if detaching itself from its maker. In the uncertain light, it seemed to duplicate itself. Two sculptures crossed the sky. The figures swirled and bobbed, reflections of one another. She heard the screech of a mattack, a carrion bird, a meat hunter. Her art had been joined by a living creature. The mattack broke the pattern. Sharp beak extended, it dove at the fragile bark wings. She cried out at the inevitable destruction. Amazingly, the sculpture slid to the side as if at her warning. The bird missed its prey and shrieked in anger. The structure spun, its crescents tilting as if alive. It climbed, then plummeted toward the raptor, shearing a feather. The two creatures circled and dove in a frenzy. She watched the dangerous aerial dance, beautiful in its menace. They forced one another higher and higher in attacks and escapes, rising beyond her earthbound vision. She stared at the sky, moonlight making her blind to the battle in the darkness. She waited, dazed from air strong with the valley's power. A long, primal screech crashed against the surrounding mountains and echoed into the distance. She could not tell if it was a wail of defeat or a shout of triumph. Chapter 2. The figure clothed in silver and white seemed to gaze past the dusty, hard-packed dirt bordered by rocks toward the hazy mountains. But the vacant blue eyes saw only a distant nothing. Legs bent in perfect form, it moved silently. Advance and retreat, advance and retreat. The steps were precise and predictable. Advance. The gloved hand propelled the bright streak of a weapon into an attack. Austin Swiftbrook wielded his foil against it just as automatically. Parry remise, parry riposte. His sparring partner was a beginner's toy he had long outgrown, incapable of mimicking complex exchanges. He lunged and flicked his blade. The bright persona, like a reverse shadow, provided no resistance. Austin skewered a place in the air where a human heart would be, more irritated than pleased by the tinkling notes indicating he had scored a point, a pretend point, in a pretend fencing bout with a pretend fencer. He should head home. Callister's soft sun would be low behind the mountain soon, washing the arena in dusk. The arena. His sister Skylar had called it that from the beginning. She and Austin had found the spot soon after moving to the remote planet. Skylar was a pudgy 9-year-old then, black hair always loose and chaotic. At 12 years old, Austin was pale, skinny, and impatient for a growth spurt he hoped would give him the long legs and arms he envied in other fencers. Two stone jumbles, one at the north end of the oval and one at the south, formed crude archways. Wind, weather, and time had shaped the natural rock, giving the illusion that the structures were intentional. The siblings had marched through them like champions. They'd saluted an imaginary crowd with their weapons and crossed blades to silent cheers. Although shorter, younger, and less experienced, Skylar had a quick wrist and was fearless. Unlike the practice dummy, she had a flair for surprises and always gave her brother a good fight. Back then, the arena was their playground, a canvas for their dreams, a place where anything could happen. Unblinking, the projection halted while the sequence reset. A young face glowed in the early dusk, yellow hair brushed to the side, blue eyes externally fixed on somewhere else. As a joke, Skylar had reprogrammed the dummy's image to look like Austin. She thought it was funny that he had to fence himself every time he used it. Austin didn't find it humorous. Not then, definitely not now. Blank-faced and empty-eyed, the white-clad figure reflected too closely how he felt. Numb and without a future. He should switch it back to the generic avatar. He told himself that many times. But he hadn't even tried to get around his sister's security lock. Austin twisted the control on the grip of his foil, cutting the weapon's power. The slim, elegant piece of engineering deserved a better opponent. Moving through the light form, he passed through his own ghost. He picked up the capsule that cast it and switched it off. The figure dissolved around him. Why did he even bother to keep up his skills? It was ridiculous. He only did it for the routine, the discipline, the old obsession that had been little more than a distraction. He prepared for something that wasn't going to happen. He would never leave Callister, not for a fencing tournament, not for anything. He wouldn't. He couldn't. He would grow old here. He would die here. He was here forever. Dusk stretched out to him from the mountains as the sun sunk behind them. Taking his time, he stored his foil and the capsule in his pack. He knew his parents wouldn't scold him for being late. 2 years of worrying and wondering about Skylar. 2 years of trying to sustain hope. That's a long time. There wasn't much energy left for anything else, certainly not for their son. Austin leaned against the north arch, feeling the day's warmth radiating from it. He glanced around the graying arena, wishing, as he always did, that his sister would jump out from nowhere and shout, "En garde!" He'd found her bag, right here in the dust, as if she'd set it down a second ago, as if at any moment she would scoop it up, laugh at him for being so grumpy, and challenge him to a race home. He pushed himself away from the stone. Shouldering his pack, he turned away from the arena and headed for the path. Stupid to think there was anything special here. It was rocks and dirt, nothing more. Yet it had somehow taken his sister. Barely an orange glow skimmed the sky as Callister's sun slid away for the night. Shadows lengthened across the abandoned oval of the arena and merged into darkness. A blast of light, fractured as if reflected by a smashed mirror, filled the gap in the northern structure of weathered rocks. The glowing spiderweb crackled like shattering crystal and spit out a small figure. He staggered and collapsed, shedding water droplets. In the fresh darkness, they plopped unseen into the dust. Slowly, shakily, he pushed himself to his knees. He stood wide-legged for balance and peered at the bit of landscape visible in the glare from the gap that had ejected him. He nodded with satisfaction, then he panicked. A damp breeze swept in from the place he had just left. Through the frame of the stone arch, thunder shattered the air. Blinding bursts flared across the sky. The storm still rolled loud and bright in that other world, but the rain that had provided safety no longer fell in heavy streaks. The beasts could not follow. They must not enter here. He sprinted away, seeking distance from the storm, roaring in its stone frame. In response, the strobe vanished, leaving the soft sound of insects. Dry air whisked moisture from cloth and skin. Groping his way in the darkness, the figure stumbled against a ring of rocks. He slipped among them and settled into an uncomfortable crevice. He shivered, hoping sunrise would be soon.
right, and let's keep it going for Danith McPherson. I had the pleasure of talking with you for like pretty much an hour last year because we had that solo slot. But one thing, listening to you again, I feel like there's this element of obsession to what you write that I am responsive to, and that I assume this is the product that you write with research, would be my guess.
I don't know what?
Research?
Research, yes.
There's such a level of detail.
Well, my sons are fencers.
Yeah.
And they provided, especially my oldest son who still fences. In fact, he just fenced at nationals. He lost every bout, but he fenced. He got 2 points on an A-level fencer, which was great. So he was happy about it. And yes, and he's my technical advisor.
So my question for you is, do you learn about stuff and then a book comes out of it, or do you start a book and then it's an excuse to learn about stuff?
Oh, I start a book and then it's like, oh, I gotta know more about that. So yes, that's really, it starts from some kind of a germ, and sometimes I get obsessed by the research, and it's like, oh, I just want to research one more thing on this. Oh, I just want to check on one more thing.
Awesome. All right, so where can people find more of your work?
Amazon, and Barnes & Noble also carries them, and I don't know what other places may have them.
All right. Our next author, Leah Cutter, writes page-turning, wildly imaginative fiction set in exotic locations such as a magical New Orleans, the ancient Orient, rural Kentucky, Seattle, Minneapolis, and many others. She writes fantasy, science fiction, mystery, literary, and horror fiction. Her short fiction has been published in magazines like Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine and Tailbones, anthologies like Fiction River and On the Web. Her long fiction has been published both by New York publishers as well as small presses. Please welcome Leah Cutter.
This is going to be a little bit different than the first two. This is contemporary urban fantasy set in Seattle. I'm reading the start of a short story that is part of a collection called the NIMBY Universe. Yes, not in my backyard. I'm going to read you the blurb for the collection. In the 1960s, the fairies, brownies, and pixies, FBP, came out of hiding and demanded equal treatment. After the all-races riots in the 1970s, humanity and the Fae came to an agreement, or several agreements. The stories in this collection take place many years afterward when humans and the Fae are integrated. Mostly. Friction occurs even in the smoothest of arrangements. These stories explore some of those arrangements while staying on the lighter side. So, these were dark novels. This is a light, funny fantasy short story called The Fairy Boy Band. It was originally published in Uncollected Anthology, which is a group of fantasy writers. We choose a new theme 3 times a year, then we all write to that theme. We publish our stories individually as well as collecting them all together so you can get them all in one place. The most recent theme was Unexpected Histories, and so it was historic urban fantasy. The one before that was Pirates. We have just so much fun. This one was actually for one about enchanted music. Oswald sat ensconced in his favorite chair next to the cheerily burning fireplace. He had a glass of his favorite scotch warming on the small end table beside him. The snifter was also a favorite. Antique, hand-blown Tiffany glassware with an indentation on one side that fit his thumb perfectly when he picked up the glass and swirled the amber liquor. His dad had given Oswald a full set of them for his 30th birthday, then died of a heart attack unexpectedly just a year later, which made Oswald cherry the glasses even more. The scent of Oswald's simple dinner of poached salmon in white wine and dill lingered in the air, though overlaid now with a smell of woodsy pine smoke. Oswald still wore his office clothes, plain blue long-sleeve shirt and tan-colored slacks, but he'd taken his shoes off and donned his heaviest wool socks to ward off the chill of the autumn evening. Everything was perfect. Silence surrounded him, so welcome after the hectic day in the office where he worked as a quality engineer, testing the code of morons. He had a new book to read, a fascinating nonfiction work about the history of pixie engineering. He was settled in for the night, no lights in his living room except for the fire, loving his electronic book reader, and at peace. No girlfriend badgering him, no new video games demanding to be played, no awkward social situations that he needed to engage in for work. Nope, just him, a book, a good scotch, and the quiet of the evening. Until that damned music started playing. Oswald tried to ignore the tinkling, which to his ears sounded like a musician tapping on a series of icicles, going from tiny to large, testing their tone, but all of them annoyingly tinny. Then came the sweeping flute, the trilling noise worse than claws on a chalkboard, making him shiver. Of course, tonight the band had added some sort of bass that sounded like frogs belching and farting. With a huge put-upon sigh, Oswald set his reader on the end table and picked up his scotch again. He couldn't go complain to the fairies making music in his backyard that he had a headache again. They didn't have to accommodate him every time he made that excuse, and he'd much rather save it for some time when he was actually ill. The arrangement with the fairies had all been written out in clear language in the agreement that he'd signed when he'd bought his house. He owned the building and land it sat on, though he had to check with the Neighborhood Homeowners Association first before he painted his house or added large decorations. He could use his house and the land as he saw fit during the day and early evening. If he gave adequate notice, he could also use the yard later at night, say for a celebration or ritual. However, the fairies owned the backyard starting 1 hour after true night had fallen, which meant during the fall and winter, like now, they started playing their damn music earlier and earlier. He'd complained to the association about the racket the fairies made every night. The association came by and merely ensured that the fairies were in compliance with quiet hours. Now, the stupid band started their jam sessions strictly on time, 1 hour after full dark, as well as ending exactly at 11 p.m. Oswald had no idea that fairies could be so punctual. They tended to work on their own fairy time. He did know that they could be assholes. He'd worked with one for a while, a stupid prima donna developer who believed his code was perfect and never needed to be tested. Thankfully, the idiot had left to form his own company. Oswald would never admit to how small his soul was and how gleefully he'd watched that asshole's company sink. Fairies had always lived beside humanity, along with brownies and pixies. Elves, trolls, vampires, and all the other creatures man had documented over the years had turned out to be just myths, thankfully. However, the consensus about ghosts was far from unanimous. It hadn't been until the civil rights movement in the 1960s that the fairies, brownies, and pixies came forward and demanded equal rights as well. The denial had been truly epic, particularly on the part of the US government. The backlash had been immediate as well. However, after the all races riots in the 1970s, an accord was signed and everyone went back to making gobs of money in the 1980s, including the fairies and the other races. However, while the FBP could cast glamours and appear to be human-sized, in reality, they didn't grow much taller than a man's knee. They had no uses for houses, cars, or TVs because they lived on a magical plane. They did like the internet, however, and Oswald had seen more than one commercial for a documentary about FBP online addiction. So the FBP frequently worked out deals like the one Oswald has signed, time-sharing yards, parks, or wilderness areas. They also paid rent by keeping the areas tidy and beautiful, which made the properties even cheaper. It also meant no one littered. Fairies would likely take any trash a human dumped in one of their areas and make it magically appear inside the human's house at the most inappropriate moment. There had been talk of forming an environmental protection agency. However, once the FBP came forward, there was no need. They wouldn't allow the land to be despoiled anymore. Any grand engineering schemes that humans came up with, like oil pipelines or drilling offshore, had to be okayed with the FBP. Of course, greedy corporations tried to get around that, only to have their operations plagued with inexplicable accidents. So many had to end up scrapping their projects. The air Oswald breathed was crystal clean and fresh. The sidewalks he walked down were empty of trash. He'd heard that in areas where the FBP weren't as well liked or as well integrated, people without homes actually lived on the streets. He couldn't imagine that. The FBP had been good for humanity in general. However, he hated the racket the fairies who lived in his backyard made every single night. It was driving him batty. They played the same songs over and over again, practicing. What could he do to evict them? And that was it.
All right. So, first of all, keep it going for Leah Cutter. And secondly, fairies are assholes.
Yes, and there's a reason it's called the NIMBY universe, not in my backyard.
So, yeah, urban fantasy. You could set your stories anywhere. Why are you setting them in this dumb old world?
I'm not setting them in this dumb old world. There's no plague. There's no plague. Humanity, there's no pollution. There's no homelessness. This is a magical fantasy world. This is not our world. Trust me, this is not our world. And so, yes, I could write fantasy about any place, but I like to take the ordinary and make it extraordinary, make it extraordinary, make it different, and make you look at that park that's so beautiful and wonder, are there fairies living there?
Awesome. So where can people find more of your work?
So, my website is leahcutter.com on Facebook. I am also at Leah Cutter. I have, my work is available wide, so I'm at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, pretty much any reputable and a lot of disreputable retailers. I have, after the end of this, I have cards. If people want to either take a photo or pick one up, they are welcome.
Awesome. All right, we have one more author for you tonight. Aimee Kuzenski is a speculative fiction author and practitioner of Filipino martial arts. You didn't think that's where that sentence was going. In the wider speculative fiction community, she is a graduate of Viable Paradise, a board member with the 4th Street Fantasy Convention, and you can find her short fiction online at Translunar Travelers Lounge. Please welcome Aimee Kuzenski.
Thank you. Rarely has my name sounded quite so portentous. I'm going to set this scene up a little bit. This is from my novella, The Golem Factory, which is set in an alternate Jerusalem where there are factories that make golems, automatons to take care of daily tasks and heavy labor, that sort of thing. Our main character is a worker in one of those factories and has just found out that she's not going to be paid for quite some time. So she's decided to steal one of the golems and try to make money off of it. It does not go that. You are correct.
Hijinks ensue.
Hijinks, so many hijinks. When she awakens this golem, because she can't possibly carry it, it says it refuses to go with. So just before this scene, she has spoken the word to destroy it. Tal knew before the sounds finished, the lines of its face falling into a deep sadness that Ava was glad to be erasing. Its eyes went first. They filmed over white and cracked with a sound like dry wood underfoot. That its extremities loosened, crumbling into powder. The effect swept inward like a fire line, legs and arms and torso and head vanishing into dust faster than they could fall. A great cloud of fine clay particles hit the floor and splashed like water. Ava coughed and gagged, tear tracks on her face catching Tal's remnants to become rivers of rust lining the hollows of her cheeks and the backs of her hands. They itched. She pushed her way between Tal's inert siblings to the floor. Slumping against the door jamb, she braced her feet against the opposite side and let herself slide down onto her rear to recover her poise and rub her eyes. She wept until her tears flowed clear. When the sobs dried away, she wiped her watch free of dust and barked a dry laugh at what it showed her. The sun was down. Tomorrow's train was beyond her means. Ava hacked and spat red on the floor. It looked like blood and tasted of despair. Damned animate monster, that's all you are, dust and my breath. A lump threatened to rise in her throat, and she pushed it down with ingrained ruthlessness. But wait, red dust. Red gold. She stared at it, thinking of the price scholars had reputedly paid for the leavings that broke the Ashkenazi quarter. And scholars might not close their doors for Passover. Ava lurched back into the cellar. She dropped to her knees and began filling the pockets of her jeans with dust. Some slipped between her fingers to stain the dark fabric red. The golems guarding the factory at night would see the dust in a heartbeat, so she wouldn't be leaving by the door now. She would need to take to the rooftops. No one in Jerusalem guarded the rooftops. It was one of the first things her thief-trained eye had noted when she moved here. With her arms and hands strengthened by sculpting limbs, traveling the roof road would probably be even easier than she remembered. Her fingers happened on a remnant of one of Tal's eyes, white as cracked ice. She rolled it into her palm, her attention snagged hard on the smooth and glittering ovoid shape that so recently had been able to see the world. The stone twitched. Ava yelped in shock and reflexively threw it across the room. It ricocheted off the immobile golems, hit the near wall, and sailed back to land and roll a mere yard from her feet. Again, the stone twitched. Across the legs of her jeans and buried in her pockets, something twitched in answer. The dust. The golem was still animate. Ava had never skinned off her jeans so quickly. Her flesh crawled as though goosebumps could shudder off Tal's remains, dried as they were on her cheeks and hands. Through it all, the twitching, the insectile tickling of clay particles moving down her legs and arms and face to join Tal's broken eye filled her with horror. She was screaming again, incoherent and loud. She was on the floor, her knees given way, scrabbling to rid herself of the itching horror, even after the physical particles had all left her skin. Her thrashing washed her up against a wall. Tal's dust marched in ant-like trails to gather into a growing cone of debris around the broken icy eye between Ava and the door. It shivered and moved and coalesced into a rough human shape, one eye black with silver flaw through it, the other socket jagged and empty. Impossible. Impossible. The word tolled bell-like in her head. Impossible. Tal's shape shuddered hard, then calmed into a flat solidity. It took a breath, then another. The black eye blinked. It stared down at her, considering. Quick as lightning, it reached down and gripped her by one arm. The ravaged face was serene. You are not my master. Her shock broken, Adva screamed. Now, I will take you to yours. Lifting Adva to her fear-drenched feet, Tal half-marched, half-dragged her to the storeroom door. Adva scrounged for purchase on the floor and walls and found none. Her breath came fast and ragged. They emerged from the storeroom and Tal stopped short. Adva snapped her head around and her knees went weak when she saw 3 golems armed with truncheons, headed by Michael. Michael, of all people! His pistol drooped when he saw her. Behind Michael, his 3 golem guards stood quiescent and uninterested. These were familiar monsters then, unlike Tal. Adva lunged toward Michael, though her own monster still held her wrist. Help! She squirmed in its grasp, feeling small bones scrape against each other in its grip. Get me away from this thing, please help me! Her free hand pulled at Michael's robes, the cheap fabric thick and rough beneath her fingers. The pistol was still between them, the sight on the steel barrel catching on her now filthy linen shirt. He gaped at her. Where are your pants? She cursed at him, the words blew enough to make even an apostate cringe. He batted her hand away and waved at Tal. Cover yourself and explain. Adva glared at him, but reached out with the tips of her fingers to snag her jeans. She shook them vigorously and pulled them on one-handed as she considered her next words. From the corner of her eye, Adva saw Tal glance at her. She woke me. I am taking her to her master. It conveniently left out the destruction and resurrection. A hysterical laugh bubbled out of her throat. Michael's brow furrowed. You woke a golem to steal it? Are you really that crazy? He flicked his gaze at Tal and the frown deepened. It only has one eye. Adva cast desperately for Michael's attention. If she could just distract everyone enough to make her own escape. Michael, it's a rogue! She squirmed harder, trying to get free. It's gone rogue! He did exactly as Adva had hoped. Michael paled and barked out the destruction command, lovely in his dark baritone. Behind him, his golem guards shivered into uncomplaining dust. Behind her, Tal did not. Michael went an ugly shade of gray, sweat sheening his skin. He laughed and knew she laughed and knew she sounded unhinged and couldn't bring herself to care. Now, Michael was backing away, bringing his trembling weapon to bear on them both. Tal broke the thick silence. Are you her master? Its voice held a curious note that appeared to confuse Michael. But she's human. He was breathing hard. Tal paused, jerking Adva to an uncomfortable halt. Humans do not have masters. She looked up in surprise, an expression of deep disquiet on his face. From the corner of her eye, Adva saw Michael shake his head violently, like a dog coming out of a lake. Adva! Adva! The confusion in his voice had vanished. Heartened by the return of his commanding tone, she snapped her gaze back to him. What? He pointed, accusatory. You woke this thing. The tremors in his hands had vanished. She felt her shoulders creep upward. Well, He cut her off with an angry gesture. How did you wake it? What did you do? Adva swallowed a curse. It did exactly what the rabbi said to do. Nothing more, nothing less. Tal wasn't her fault. It was wrong somehow. She glanced back, unrepentant. The grip on her wrist loosened a fraction. Tal was paying the conversation close attention, its one white eye focusing first on her, then Michael, the silver crack rotating like a human's iris. Michael stepped closer, his dark eyes roving over Tal's body. You're lying. That's not possible, he began, then stopped. He snatched Tal's hand, the hand holding Adva's wrist, and turned it over to display the underside of the forearm. He grunted. She paused on the verge of attempting escape once more. What? She glanced down and did a double take. There, in her own familiar script, were her initials, just like the initials she'd carved into the last arm before she left the line today. So what? There are only a few arm builders. It's not all that surprising. Did you also try to destroy it? Before I did? Michael turned on her when she didn't respond instantly. Tal's attention was absorbed on the marks on its wrist. Michael managed to snatch her hand away and used it to yank her to his chest. His fingers dug into her flesh. Answer me! She yelped, her heart like a rabbit in her chest. Yes, she hissed the admission. Did it work? Unlike Tal's grip, Michael's fingertips would leave bruises. She squirmed. Does it look like it worked? Michael! He shook her again, relentless as a terrier. Did it work? How to explain the evening? Ava opted for simplicity. It came back. Now it was Michael's turn to curse until the air blistered. She stared at him open-mouthed and he grimaced. You used the wrong chant. Ava's hands clenched into fists. It's the one I was taught. Was he really going to blame her for this? He shook his head as though he'd heard her thought. They taught you the traditional chant from before the factories were sanctioned. The chants have never been changed and refined to keep the builder separate from the waker, separate from the master. He groaned, running his free hand through his hair. The old chants had a lot of loopholes. Labeling your work was one of them. She hissed. Why the hell did they teach the old chants then? He ignored her. We need to call company rabbis. He was now covered in a fine sheet of sweat. Frowning, she glanced over at Tal. It's Passover. They aren't supposed to. They can, and they will. And that's where I'm stopping.
All right, let's keep it going for Aimee Kuzenski. So where can people find your words?
You can find this book and my other short novel on Amazon. I have a short story out at Transcendent Travelers Lounge. And fingers crossed I will have a new book for you next year.
Awesome. That is our show, and keep it going for all of your new authors tonight. Feel free to stick around for a few minutes and harass them, ask them questions, and buy their books. But thank you so much for coming. We got 2 more reading hours this weekend and many, many more Wordslinger events. Thank you all for coming out.